Okay, today's session, physiological considerations for exercise in children. These are the objectives we'll be looking at both in this recorded session and the actual class session. Exploring physiological considerations for exercise in children, i.e. the difference between working with children and adults, and some of the symptoms and presentation of certain injuries that might happen in childhood and how they can be managed and treated. Okay, there's a little graphic for you to start with about overuse injuries. Have a little bit of a pause now just to have a look at that. Okay, another one there. Again, have a pause if you want a quick look at that. I won't go through them individually. Okay, so four main causes of overuse injuries. Okay, load, so effectively overtraining, so training too often without adequate rest and recovery. Poor technique, which might affect your biomechanics and put your body out of kind of skew. Posture, poor posture, again might lead to putting incorrect amounts of force through certain parts of your body, and inappropriate surface footwear equipment in general. Okay, so recent trends have suggested that overuse injuries tend to be increasing, so this will have a little bit more of a sporting context, as we do know that there's a trend towards children being more obese, so this would be related to those children that are active, i.e. the ones that do take part due to an excess due to intense training starting at a younger age. Okay, so gifted players, talented players in sport, whether it's football, basketball, rugby, and academy systems in particular, tend to have much more physical activity than other kids. So this does need to be adapted for development and age, which isn't always the case. Okay, so it takes about 20 years for us to develop from being a newborn child to maturity in terms of our physiological processes, and about 25 years for the brain to develop. Okay, during this time, your limbs, your body, your trunk, and all different parts of your body will vary in terms of how long they are, how much there is of them, and how much they weigh. So we do need some sort of understanding of how the skeleton grows in terms of how the muscles and soft tissue actually grow around that as well, to understand how we should deal with growth and development and any potential injuries that might occur. Okay, so we have to take into account as well, different children grow at different rates, and the same child might have spurts within that, and something called peak height velocity, where they're growing at their maximum amount. Okay, so your changes in your limb length, for example, might have an effect on how you look in terms of performance. So you might look like a little bit like Bambi on ice, where your brain and your joints are growing it and aren't adapting at the same speed. Okay, so main difference between adults and youth. So in terms of cardiovascular considerations, walking and running, oxygen consumption of children is about 10 to 30% higher than adults at a submaximal pace. So not flat out, but they need more oxygen to do things like jogging, walking. And 20 to 30% more oxygen is needed per unit of body mass when running. So they obviously got shorter legs, so shorter stride length, and take more strides compared to an adult. So they have lower aerobic power values. Okay, so they have a smaller fat-free body. Okay, so basically they not have the same endurance levels that an adult would have, and they don't generate the high levels of blood lactate during maximal exercise. Just have a think of some of the implications for that when you're planning sessions, or maybe when you're dealing with reducing the impact of growth injuries. In terms of respiratory, in terms of your breathing, your lungs, etc., you tend to have a shorter respiratory cycle, which means your respiratory rate's higher, so you breathe in and out more often. Minute ventilation is actually lower, so you take more air in and out during a minute. And that's a little summary table of some other physiological responses to acute, so intense short-term exercise of children compared with adults. So on the left column, you've got the variables, and on the right, the difference between children and adults. So just as an example for the first one, absolute oxygen uptake, so the volume of oxygen in a minute, your VO2 max, is lower in children than it would be in adults. Okay, if you want to have a look at the rest, just have a quick pause and have a look through them. In terms of neuromuscular control, so how your brain controls your movement and your muscles, that's still developing. So the communication between your nervous system, so your brain and your spinal cord, and your muscular system, actually moving your limbs and your joints, takes a while to develop. You tend to get more and more neurons forming in childhood, and more neurotransmitters, so the way that they talk to each other or communicate with each other becomes more efficient, and also the myelin sheath that wraps around those connections develops and becomes thicker, again allowing more efficient communication between different brain cells. Some more cardiovascular considerations. There's not a lot you can do really with VO2 max, so the maximum volume of oxygen uptake with training. Okay, so that's another thing you need to bear in mind when training. Stroke volume is lower when you're resting and working. So stroke volume is what? Okay, the amount of blood ejected in one stroke or pump from your heart. Okay, your cardiac output is lower, can be up to between 1 to 3 litres a minute lower than an adult. What's cardiac output and how is it calculated? Okay, it's the amount of blood ejected per minute. So you times your heart rate by your stroke volume. Quite a simple sum, that one. So therefore, they have a higher heart rate to compensate for the less amount of blood that's going around the body. There's an equation to find maximum heart rate for adults, so 220 minus your age. Okay, it's thought that for 16-year-olds and under, it's not very valid. Okay, so maybe a heart rate of 170 to 180 BPM might be more appropriate. Growth spurt, basically at a certain point where you achieve adolescence and start to go through puberty, children suddenly start to develop at a rapid rate, particularly their bones. Okay, so between 10 and 12 for girls, with a peak being about 12 to 13, ending about the age of 18. For boys, you start about 12 to 14, peak at 14 to 15 in terms of growth, and that will end by about the age of 20. Okay, so obviously, if you're growing and your bones and your muscles and your coordination is changing, that can have implications for physical activity. Okay, so it can be also a vulnerable time for musculoskeletal injury. Okay, so soft tissue around the joints tends to become stretched as your bones start to lengthen, and it can't keep up with them. So things, when we say soft tissue, we mean tendons, ligaments, and muscles. Okay, so things like maintenance stretches are fine, but nothing too strenuous at this stage of development. So your bones will grow and harden at different speeds. The humerus, so your upper arm bone, about 80% of the growth actually starts at the top end towards your shoulder. Therefore, that would be the most vulnerable place to get an injury. And your lower arm, your radius, and lower, it's at the distal, the furthest end of your arm towards your wrist. And again, that would be the vulnerable area. And your legs, most growth occurs at the lower end of the femur and the top end of your tibia. Therefore, the bit that's being pulled the most would be around your knee joint. So that, again, is the most vulnerable part. The bones grow due to growth plates or epiphyseal plates, which contain the cells that constantly divide and basically stretch. So most common injuries would be around these growth plate areas, as you can see from this arrow here. So too much use, trauma, will lead to some sort of damage or injury, such as the Salter-Harris fractures. Okay, so excessive loads, as we mentioned earlier, on those growth plates can damage the existing plates and affect further growth. 2-to-1 ratio, so apparently, according to this research, your upper extremities are more likely to be injured than your lower extremities, twice as much, and girls allegedly twice as likely to be injured as, boys twice as likely to be injured as girls, possibly because they're growing faster and to a greater height in general. Okay, so like we said, the distal points are the furthest part away from the growth plate, is the most likely injury point. In terms of guidelines then, avoid too many high impact moves on the spot where the same forces are travelling up through the skeleton repeatedly. If they're hot, make sure they're adequately hydrated due to thermal stress. Kids tend to get hotter quicker than adults and tend to find it harder to cool down. Be very careful when using resistance training. It's not to say not to use it at all, but you probably want to use higher reps and lower resistance. Okay, so low weights, but do it more often. Okay, so children will have less glycogen in the liver and the muscles and less able to do a lot of high intensity and anaerobic work, such as repeated sprints. Okay, so that's the end of the slideshow. What I want you to do now is you have to take the quiz in the next section. The section after that, if you read the resources on Padlet and make notes and find your own resources, and then have a look at the task for the class activity and bring those notes for this next session.